everyone. I normally don't do things like this, but I kind of figured with everything that's happening right now with the administration change, and I'm not trying to share any opinions of my own, but everything that's happening with the administration change, I figured that I would do my best to kind of try to educate on the things that I know about. And what I'm seeing a lot in the news is people talking about the Department of Education. Is it a waste of money? Is it not doing invaluable things? Is it going to be cut? Is it not going to be cut, et cetera, et cetera? So this is kind of my brief presentation and webinar on the United States Department of Education. Is it still going to exist? And if it doesn't, how does this going to affect you if you have children? And so, that's me. But obviously, just a reminder, I have my own consulting services business. That's kind of how I'm doing this and why I'm doing this. It's kind of a personal project, but also kind of, trying to support that. So what's happening, with the Department of Education? There's funding and policy changes. The Trump administration is clear, and I'm not taking sides one way or the other, but they are clear that they don't want to fund the Department of Education anymore. They want to abolish it. And he literally said that he wants Linda McMahon, who he has promoted to Secretary of Education. That's right, the WWE person. He wants her to work herself out of a job. And that includes through DEI practices, trying to ban institutions that get federal funding from implementing DEI policies and departments. And he gave a timeline, I believe, of 2 weeks. That leaves funds like Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, and special education funds in limbo. If the department folds, who's going to take that up? The Treasury Department, the Interior? Student loans that's managed by the Department of Education, and there are federal student loans. I have quite a bit myself. But then you also have the argument of constitutionality in the 10th Amendment. So the 10th Amendment states that the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states. The Education Department is not under the Constitution. So there is an argument for it not being constitutional. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just saying facts. But I did want to show this video of Linda McMahon getting stone cold stunned. Oh my goodness, words are hard. Stone cold stunned, I guess would be the right word to say that. We are not a serious country. Oh my goodness. Okay, moving on. That was real. That was the 2000s. That was real. So why should you care? Do you have a kid that goes to school? Pretty much. College or K-12 education. But not even just if they go to school, if their school receives title money. The title money threshold is if about, this is a general rule of thumb, it's a little bit more specific than this. But if a school receives, or school has 40% or more of their students with free or reduced lunch, then that school gets title money. That's very general and it's a more in depth than that, but that's kind of a layman's understanding. Does your child have aspirations to go to college? Like I mentioned, student loans is run by the government. I have government student loans. I know many people that do. And where is that going to go? Do you have a kid with special education needs? The federal government supports not only legislation for students with special education needs, but also enforces it. And honestly, even if you don't have kids, you don't have any of these other things, your property tax money goes to schools. Do you have a vested interest in where that goes? So here's kind of so the little asterisk is saying that AI helped me make some parts of this. So this chart was made by AI And I did it, but AI helped me with it. So here's what the Department of Education does do and what the Department of Education does not do. So they administer financial aid programs like Pell Grants, but also subsidized and unsubsidized loans. Distributes funding through programs like Title One, Two, Three, and 4. We'll talk about those later. They oversee the compliance with civil rights laws. They analyze data. They support and fund educational research. And they support the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and enforce them. And they administer grant programs. And there's a lot of grant programs that are funded by the Federal Department of Education. That is not the majority of where most school districts' funding comes from, but I believe it's 8%. Don't quote me on that. 8% of all funding comes from the Federal Education, Department of Education. But what it does not do, it doesn't set curriculum or instructional standards. That's your local school district, that's your school board, that's your school district leaders. It doesn't run or manage any public schools. The Secretary of Education is not in charge of all the state's education departments. They're not their boss. Think of it more like if you're in New York, a BOCES kind of relationship where BOCES is not part of a school district, but they provide a lot of support to school districts. They don't require states to adopt teaching methods, curriculums, textbooks. That's not them. They don't establish teacher certification requirements. That's up to the states. That's why you have some states where pretty much anybody can be a teacher. And then you have some states like New York and California where it is incredibly difficult to get your teacher certificate requirements. Just an example here, a personal example. I am certified in New York to be a principal, but I can't be a teacher just because of a silly reciprocity rule with where I tried to transfer my Wisconsin certificates to New York. They don't mandate school funding amounts. That is again local and decided by property taxes, which is a whole nother situation on how schools are funded. They don't control discipline policies or classroom management. Some schools have more authoritative disciplinary policies, and some schools have more, how do I want to say this, liberal school discipline policies. But that's not decided by the federal Department of Education. Or they don't regulate private or homeschooling curriculum. That is again state by state. So let's just go into some of these things and get a little bit more background knowledge. So Title One, that's when I mentioned, for to support students experiencing poverty. So if your school has 40% of its students getting free or reduced lunch, and again, that's a very surface level understanding of it. If they're getting 40% of, if they have 40% of students with free or reduced lunch, they get Title One funding. That's about 47.1% of the student population who are in a school that gets title funding. 46,000 schools. Title II, that's just supporting professional development for teachers and principals. Title III, that's funding for English language learners. There's over 5 million English language learners, most of which are probably Spanish speakers, but that money goes towards any programming for them. And Title IV is funding for student loans. Only 1.5% of students are awarded full tuition scholarships. If you are not one of those 1.5% or your child's not one of those 5%, you're probably getting student loans. So that's why that matters. One, three, and four are probably more important. Two's not necessarily as important to your average family or your average student, but one, three, and four maybe. But then there's also Title IX other discrimination. So Title IX, as most of us know, protects people against discrimination based on their sex. Now, when I say sex, this was written before our modern day discussions on sex and gender. I'm not sure how it's been edited or if it's been edited, and I'm not sure if the new administration has edited it back. But this does apply to K-12 education and collegiate education. That's enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. So the Department of Education has its own Office of Civil Rights, which if you have a complaint of the discrimination against a school district, a school, or state education department, you go to them and they investigate and they file a report and they may take legal action to enforce compliance. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do and it's a whole process, but at the same time, it exists and it's there for everybody to use. If the Department of Education folds, who's going to enforce this? Who's going to enforce the anti-discrimination clauses? Who's going to enforce Title IX? That's a question that I have. And you'll notice in this PowerPoint, there are a lot of things that are vague, and that's because the administration has been vague on how they're approaching it. For example, the president's advisor, Elon Musk, said that Department of Education no longer exists when it still does because it's funded by Congress. These are the kind of things that are left vague, so a lot of people are left guessing. So special education and IDEA. So IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act. This is guarantee special education services for students who need it. So that's a free and appropriate education. IEPs, this is through IDEA. IEPs are a little different than 504s. We'll talk about that in a second. But, IDEA also recommends, or not recommends, mandates education being the least restrictive environment. So if you have a student that is in a self-contained class, that can be in a consultant services class, then they're supposed to be there. If you have a student that's in a specialized school that can be in general education, they're supposed to be there. It goes from 3 to 21. So birth to college almost. And it provides the legal rights to these parents and students. Again, that's enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. So an IEP versus 504. IEPs, they're required by IDEA versus the 504, which are Rehabilitation Act. The IEP provides specialized instruction, so special education services, while 504 only provides some accommodations. For example, a 504, if you have a student with ADHD, a 504 will give them an alternate testing placement or an alternate seating assignment. An IEP will give them actual differentiated instruction. That's on what the student is learning versus how the student's learning. And thank you for this Venn diagram. That's my reference page, but this is not mine. Just a heads up. So states receive the fundings for IEPs. They don't receive any funding for 504s. And their IEPs are very specific list of disabilities for 504s can be any disability. That said, parents need to be involved in it. Doesn't cost anything, and it meets the needs of the person receiving the plan. But they're both by law and enforceable. So I'm going to go into the topic of probably the millennia at this point, DEI. So the administration said that all education institutions with DEI departments programming needs to remove those programming options, remove those departments to retain their federal funding. If then they have 2 weeks to do it. But that's relatively vague. What goes under a DEI programming? Title I, does that go under a DEI programming? Or Title III? That's focusing on equity for our students who speak a different language first. Then race and LGBT status, ethnicity. What does this mean? I don't know. I'm not sure what the administration's overall goal with it is and where that's going, but I'm just trying to tell the facts that that is what the administration's trying to do. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it is kind of vague in how it's happening. But a big part of it is transgender students, and specifically, I believe the state of Maine, the Department of Education is targeting the Maine Department of Education because of a transgender student who is participating in sports. Again, I'm not taking sides on whether On the participation aspect, I'm just saying that that is something that's happening. Research, that's another thing. The Department of Education funds a lot. Almost $1 billion were cut from research projects. That included, looking at accelerated math and tracking student a long-term project that was tracking students learning from kindergarten to high school. That's a lot of money that's being cut from us trying to become better teachers. Pre any of this research, you had people that were kind of eyeballing it. And that was something that principals and superintendents would do all the time. They would just go with what their gut feeling was. Now that we have access to so much research with the internet, with social media platforms, with just how we've communicated as a society over the past 50, 60, 70, 80 years, we've accelerated student learning in a lot of ways. And we're beyond the my gut says this. So how does this really affect you? So the states will have to make up this gap. If a lot of funding is cut, this or a lot of funding doesn't come through, the states will have to make this up. And some states can't make that. And I would wager most states can't make up the gap. It is a large gap to make up with what the feds cover. That may lead to program cuts. And to save money, that could be band, that could be football, that could be AIS reading, that could be anything. And that will widen gaps over time. With COVID-19, there was a learning loss. Many students are behind in reading. They're grade level, two grade levels behind in reading, writing, math, science. These funding cuts would only widen these gaps. And this doesn't just affect the public schools. Charter schools get public funding. They get Title I funding. They get Title III funding. Private schools sometimes get access to Title I funding. Private schools also sometimes get access to government grants. This affects education everywhere. So what can you do? Stay informed. Please, 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 please stay informed. That is the number one thing. Participating in your child's board. Public schools and most private and charter schools will have a board of education. Ask them, what is the plan? And I know that's a hard question. And if you're on a board of education, that is a very hard question to answer. If you're a school superintendent or school principal, that is a hard question to answer. And they may not have that answer right away. But at the same time, if we're talking about your child's education, that is a question that needs to be asked. Advocate with your representatives on what you believe should be done. Regardless of whether you think agree with the Department of Education or not, the funding still needs to happen for a lot of these things. Our children deserve that. I'm not recommending this. I'm just offering it as an option. Consider homeschooling, though. That's not for everyone, and it's an option. I've met people in my personal life that were homeschooled and they were very successful. But it's mileage will vary. And then consult with me or another expert. So, like I mentioned, I have my own consulting services company. Even if you don't want to consult with me, and a lot of your situations can probably be resolved with a free half-hour consultation. Talk to a teacher, talk to a principal, talk to somebody who is on a board of education they know. Talk to them about if you have concerns about your child's education and what this means for them and what you should be doing about it. So that's really all I kind of have right now. This is kind of a tough time. It's been a tough time in education for several years since COVID now. And this is just throwing a bigger wrinkle. I am not trying to share opinions, but at the same time, I'm a little concerned. I don't know what this means, and I think there's a lot of people, both in the Department of Education, at state education department level, and school district level, that are concerned. So I'm curious where this is going to go, and I hope that in the end there is positive outcomes, one way or the other. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about this. Feel free to email or call me if you have any further questions. And I'll help you the best I can. And even if I don't know the answer right away, I can pretty much find out how to find it pretty quickly. So feel free to give me an email or call if you have any questions.